A decade before the world even began to understand how radically financial markets were about to change, a small group of visionary investors locked themselves inside a quiet boardroom and began crafting a private equity playbook unlike anything the industry had ever seen. They believed that the old rules, buy, strip, flip, were dying faster than anyone noticed, and that the next era would belong only to those who could see beyond numbers and into the deeper patterns shaping global behavior. They studied shifting demographics, emerging technologies, cultural movements, and geopolitical tensions, not as scattered pieces of information but as interconnected signals pointing toward one truth: value would no longer be extracted, it would be engineered. Their playbook started with a single principle: whoever could build companies around human needs and technological inevitabilities before the rest of the market even recognized them would dominate the next 30 years. So they began assembling a data engine unlike anything private equity had used before, a system that scanned industries not for profits but for pressure points where innovation was unavoidable, where consumer frustration was at its peak, and where a solution was destined to explode. Instead of chasing current returns, they targeted tomorrow's inevitabilities: AI-enabled logistics, decentralized finance, predictive healthcare, automated manufacturing, climate-resilient infrastructure, adaptive learning platforms, and digital identity networks. Every decision they made was guided by a formula: own the bottleneck before the world realizes it's a bottleneck. And so, their journey began quiet, hidden, and 10 years ahead of the curve. The playbook's second principle was ruthless in its clarity: buy early, build aggressively, scale globally. These investors believed that the biggest opportunity was not in maximizing existing companies but in reinventing them from the ground up before the future demanded it. They would enter a sector like supply chain analytics, not because the business was currently booming, but because their models predicted a global logistics crisis years before the pandemic would make it obvious. They invested in predictive software for hospitals before AI was even seen as safe, convinced that medical systems would eventually need algorithms to handle billions of data points beyond human capacity. They poured capital into decentralized authentication systems long before digital identity theft became one of the world's most expensive problems. But their strategy didn't end at buying. They deployed teams of technologists, behavioral psychologists, data scientists, and operations architects into each company. Their mission: break the business apart and rebuild it around automation, intelligence, and extreme user-centric design. If a company relied on manual workflows, those workflows were eliminated. If a company wasn't collecting data, it was redesigned to become a data engine. If teams were slow, they were restructured around velocity, experimentation, and iterative growth. This wasn't private equity as the world knew it, this was evolution by force. The third principle in their playbook focused on culture transformation, a concept most investors never dared to touch. They believed that a company's culture was not a soft intangible but the single most powerful lever of compounding performance. So when they acquired a business, they didn't start with financial models, they started with people models. They mapped communication flows, psychological safety, decision bottlenecks, and leadership tendencies. They replaced fear-based management with systems of radical clarity, collaborative intelligence, and incentive structures aligned with long-term innovation rather than short-term survival. Employees who had felt invisible suddenly became idea generators. Managers who had been stuck in outdated hierarchies learned how to make agile decisions. Innovation didn't happen in expensive labs, it happened in corridors, Slack threads, micro-experiments, and rapid feedback loops. And as culture shifted, productivity surged. What looked to the outside world like a miraculous turnaround was actually the result of deep behavioral rewiring. The investors knew that in a future driven by speed, the companies that could learn the fastest would outperform every competitor, so they built cultures that learned like organisms, adapting quickly, sensing friction instantly, and responding with precision. But the true genius of their playbook appeared in their risk strategy. Instead of diversifying blindly or hedging based on traditional models, they created what they called predictive asymmetry maps. These maps tracked emerging global tensions, energy transitions, water scarcity, digital warfare, migration waves, political instability, AI policy shifts, and calculated how these forces would collide with existing industries. By doing so, they positioned themselves in markets where risk wasn't just manageable, it was profitable. For example, they knew long before mainstream analysts that energy volatility would reshape manufacturing costs worldwide. So while competitors focused on traditional energy assets, this group invested in microgrid technologies, thermal storage systems, and AI-driven power routing software. When others worried about inflation, they invested in autonomous supply chains that could operate independently of labor shortages. When experts debated the future of education, they quietly acquired adaptive learning platforms capable of scaling to millions of students at marginal cost. Their risk strategy wasn't about avoiding danger, it was about understanding where the world would panic and placing capital where panic would create opportunity. And as history unfolded, their predictions came true. The fifth paragraph of their evolution revolved around an idea so powerful it became the core of their competitive edge: compounding intelligence. They realized that data from one company could strengthen another if analyzed through shared models. So they built an interconnected network of companies, manufacturing firms, logistics providers, medical platforms, fintech startups, education systems, all feeding anonymized intelligence into a central system. This created a feedback loop where success in one sector accelerated breakthroughs in another. For example, predictive algorithms developed for healthcare were adapted to optimize factory workflows. Supply chain intelligence from logistics was used to teach financial models how to anticipate market shocks. User behavior analytics from education platforms helped retail companies personalize customer experiences. No private equity firm had ever created cross-industry intelligence ecosystems because no one had imagined companies as learning organisms contributing to a collective mind. But these investors did. And as their network grew, it became almost impossible for competitors to understand how they kept winning every deal, scaling every acquisition, and innovating faster than the market. What outsiders saw as luck was actually a decade-long system of compounding intelligence, quietly shaping entire industries from the back end. Their sixth principle was a radical stance on time horizons. While the industry obsessed over 3 to 5 year exits, this group planned in 20-year arcs. They understood that long-term technological inevitabilities often looked irrational to short-term investors. But if you controlled the infrastructure behind the future AI, robotics, digital identity, energy storage, data networks, you controlled the value creation cycle itself. Instead of flipping companies, they scaled them into category leaders and then used them as platforms to acquire smaller, complementary businesses. They didn't chase valuation peaks, they built valuation gravity. Their companies became magnets, partners sought them out, developers wanted to work with them, governments wanted to align with them, and large corporations wanted to integrate with them. This long-term view also meant they weren't afraid of temporary losses. A company operating at a loss today was acceptable as long as it was building a strategic capability that competitors couldn't replicate. They believed that true power came not from short-term profitability but from owning the layer of infrastructure that the entire future economy would rely on. And slowly, their portfolio began to resemble the blueprint of a new world, fully integrated, intelligent, adaptive, and impossible to compete against. Yet, the most astonishing part of their strategy was their exit model. They didn't exit companies by selling them, they exited by turning them into autonomous ecosystems capable of generating infinite expansions. Their goal wasn't liquidity, it was legacy. They designed companies to be platforms with modular product opportunities, global expansion pathways, embedded AI systems, and recurring revenue structures. Each company was built to spawn new ventures, acquire smaller players, or expand into adjacent verticals without needing new ownership. In some cases, they even merged unexpected sectors: healthcare with fintech, logistics with energy, education with AI identity verification. These hybrid companies weren't just leaders, they were category creators. And when the world finally caught up to the trends these investors had predicted 10 years earlier, they already owned the infrastructure, the data, the talent, and the culture to dominate. Their exits became case studies not because they sold companies for high multiples but because the companies they built continued to grow with or without them, creating value beyond valuation. In the final movement of their story, the world finally realized that this group had been shaping the future quietly while everyone else chased the present. Their playbook, born from curiosity, courage, and a willingness to think a decade ahead, became the unofficial blueprint for the next generation of private equity. Analysts called it revolutionary. Competitors called it unfair. Economists called it inevitable. But for the investors who created it, it was simply the logical evolution of value creation. They understood that the future does not reward the fastest or the strongest, it rewards the most prepared. And preparation requires seeing what others ignore, investing in what others fear, building what others cannot imagine, and trusting a vision that stretches beyond a single cycle. Their playbook was not just a financial strategy, it was an operating system for the next era of human progress. And now, as industries transform, technologies accelerate, and the world enters a new age of intelligence, the companies built on this 10 years ahead playbook are not just surviving, they are defining the future itself.